On February 25th, something is happening in the Strait of Hormuz that most headlines are not fully capturing right now. Iran physically closed parts of the world's most critical oil corridor last week. Not a warning, an actual operational closure during live drills. The IRGC Navy ran live fire exercises inside the strait itself and shut down specific maritime zones for several hours with missiles launching. And while those drills were running, a Russian Navy warship sailed directly into Bandar Abbas, Iran's primary naval base on the strait. The official name of that Iranian exercise was Smart Control of the Strait of Hormuz. That name was not chosen by accident, because 20% of the world's daily oil supply moves through that 21-mile corridor, around 20 million barrels, every single day. And on February 17th, Iran closed part of it during active nuclear talks, while 2 American carriers were already moving toward the region. Here's what makes the timing almost impossible to call coincidence and worth slowing down to examine very carefully. Those IRGC drills began on the exact same day that US and Iranian officials were sitting across a table in Geneva, Switzerland, diplomats negotiating a nuclear deal in a Swiss conference room, warships closing the world's most important oil lane simultaneously, both deliberate, both coordinated. And in my view, that is not a contradiction, that is the actual message being sent. Iran was communicating something to Washington that cannot be said in a diplomatic cable or at a negotiating table. The message was simple: we control this geography. We can demonstrate that in real time, even while your envoys are in the room. Now, let's be precise about what that closure actually was, because the framing matters enormously for understanding what follows. Iran did not halt all commercial shipping. Tankers continued moving. What closed were specific military approach corridors for several hours. Prior notice was sent to airlines to avoid Iranian airspace in the south, because the IRGC was firing missiles during the drill. Analysts call this a calibrated disruption, not a blockade, not a declaration of war, but a live demonstration of a real capability. Insurance markets noticed immediately. Oil moved higher. The phrase Strait of Hormuz closure hit Bloomberg terminals within hours. The reason that phrase alone moves markets comes down to one number published by JP Morgan: $120 to $130 per barrel in a full closure scenario. Brent crude was trading at around $64 that same week. The gap between 64 and 130 is the financial architecture behind every decision in Washington. And Iran just demonstrated in real time on a day when nuclear talks were actively ongoing that the threat is not theoretical. But the layer that most financial coverage skipped entirely is what happened the day after those IRGC drills concluded. Russia escalated the signal. The Russian Navy corvette Stoiky docked at Bandar Abbas on February 18th, one day after the IRGC drill ended. Russian and Iranian naval officers stood together on deck. Official photographs were released. The message was visual and deliberate. Russian presidential aide Nikolai Patrushev gave a formal interview that same week declaring that BRICS needs a full-fledged strategic maritime dimension. That phrase, from a senior Kremlin official, was not diplomatic language. It was a policy declaration framed around a live naval exercise. The exercise he was referencing, Maritime Security Belt 2026, is not a new improvisation. This is the 7th consecutive year it has run. Russia, China, and Iran. Same strait, same week of the year. 7 consecutive years. That pattern is not a coincidence. It is a design. What this suggests is that the timing of the 2026 edition was not driven by the crisis. The crisis was allowed to build around a date already fixed. These 3 governments knew the carriers were coming. They tracked the Gerald R. Ford transiting Gibraltar on February 20th. They saw the 150-plus U.S. aircraft being repositioned across Europe and the Middle East, the largest American air buildup in the region since 2003. And they did not change the schedule. They showed up on time, with cameras rolling, corvette docked, drills running, photographs published. As of February 25th, the 3rd round of U.S.-Iran nuclear talks is confirmed for this week in Geneva, facilitated by Oman. Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi says Tehran is prepared to talk. The White House says there has been some progress, but gaps remain. Meanwhile, the USS Abraham Lincoln sits approximately 150 miles off the Omani coast. The USS Gerald R. Ford is moving east through the Mediterranean. Senior U.S. national security officials have briefed Trump that full military strike capability will be in position by mid-March, according to NBC News. Trump said last Thursday, "We may have to take it a step further, or we may not. You're going to find out over the next, probably 10 days. That is the window this entire video is built around. Not the history of the nuclear program, not decades of sanctions. The specific 10-day window in which the carriers, the drills, the Geneva table, and the Russian corvette are all converging simultaneously. To understand why that convergence matters, you need to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually is in physical terms, not on a map, in practice. It is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. The usable shipping lanes for large vessels are roughly 2 miles wide going in and 2 miles wide going out. That is all the navigable space there is. Every supertanker, every military warship, every LNG carrier entering or leaving the Persian Gulf uses those same lanes. There is no alternative route. Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline moves around 5 million barrels per day. The UAE's Fujairah pipeline adds roughly 1.5 million. Combined bypass capacity sits around 6.5 million barrels per day. The strait currently moves 20 million. That gap cannot be closed in weeks or months. Whoever can make those 21 miles feel ungovernable holds leverage over the global economy that no sanctions list and no aircraft carrier can fully neutralize. Iran's exercise last week was named Smart Control of the Strait of Hormuz. In my view, that was not a military designation. It was a policy statement, not a threat to close the strait permanently. A demonstration that the capability exists and can be activated on short notice at a time of Iran's choosing. That distinction between a permanent closure and a demonstrated capability is the most important analytical line in this story, and it is widely missed. Drop a comment right now. Do you think Tehran walks out of Geneva this week with a framework, or does this end differently? I read every comment on videos like this, and if this kind of analysis is why you're here, hit the like button now. It tells me to keep going deeper on stories that aren't being fully told, and in part 2, we go inside exactly what Iran has built in that water. Iran does not need to sink a single American warship to win this confrontation, and that is the actual strategic doctrine Tehran has been building for 2 decades. Understanding how that doctrine works, layer by layer, is the only analytical framework that makes sense of what the IRGC demonstrated during those drills last week. Start with something almost no Western outlet properly explained when covering the exercise, and it begins with the physical geography of the strait itself. The Strait of Hormuz is not a wide open ocean. At its narrowest point, it is 21 miles across, and the usable shipping lanes are roughly 2 miles wide in each direction. That is all the navigable space available. Every supertanker, every military escort vessel, every LNG carrier entering or leaving the Persian Gulf moves through those same 4 miles. There's no other route. There's no way to approach from a different angle. The geography itself is the first and most powerful weapon Iran holds in this standoff. Inside that geography, Iran has spent the last 2 decades building what open-source defense analysts describe as a layered denial architecture, not a fleet designed to fight the American Navy in open battle. A system designed to make those 21 miles too costly to use without a political decision Washington cannot easily make. The first layer, and arguably the most underreported element of last week's drill, is what sits on the seabed and just beneath the surface of the water. According to estimates cited by the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency and updated by congressional researchers in 2025, Iran holds approximately 6,000 naval mines. That number has grown steadily over the past several years, even under sanctions pressure. 6,000 mines of multiple types, moored, bottom resting, and influence triggered. Influence mines are particularly relevant here. They do not require physical contact with a ship. They detonate in response to a vessel's magnetic field or its acoustic signature. You cannot see them. You cannot avoid them without knowing exactly where they are. And clearing them, lane by lane, under hostile conditions, takes weeks, not hours. Here is the critical insight that defense analysts return to consistently when modeling what a Hormuz disruption actually looks like in the real world. Iran does not need to detonate a single mine to win the economic battle. The credible threat of mining is sufficient to freeze commercial shipping almost immediately. The moment credible intelligence emerges that Iran has begun loading mines onto fast boats, maritime insurance rates spike within hours. That is documented historical behavior, not speculation. It happened during the Iran-Iraq tanker war in the 1980s. It happened during the 2019 Gulf of Oman incidents. Insurance markets respond to probability, not to detonation. No coverage means no tanker captain transits the strait voluntarily. No transit means no oil flow. 20 million barrels per day stops moving, without Iran firing a single weapon. That is the architecture of the first layer, not kinetic destruction. Economic paralysis through uncertainty, activated on demand at a time of Iran's choosing. The second layer sits slightly deeper, literally, and received almost no attention in the mainstream coverage of last week's exercise. During the Smart Control drills, Iranian state media confirmed that Ghadir-class and Fateh-class submarines conducted operations from Iran's 3 strategic islands in the strait. Those islands, Abu Musa, Greater Tunb, and Lesser Tunb, sit directly in the middle of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has controlled all 3 since 1971, over 50 years. From those positions, a submarine does not need range. It is already inside the engagement zone before any defensive system on an approaching vessel has fully activated. The Ghadir class is not impressive by conventional naval standards. Small, limited range, relatively slow. Inside the strait, those characteristics become almost irrelevant. A defense security analysis published in January 2026 noted that the Ghadir can rest motionless on the seabed, exploiting the high ambient noise levels of shallow Gulf waters. Advanced sonar systems are optimized for deeper, quieter ocean environments. In waters that frequently fall below 50 meters depth, the acoustic picture becomes far more complicated. Former Iranian Navy Commander Rear Admiral Khanzadi described the Ghadir by saying it can do what the U-boats did in World War II, a direct reference to commerce raiding through attrition. That comparison is worth sitting with for a moment. U-boats did not defeat the British Navy in open battle. They made the cost of transiting certain waters feel unacceptably high over time. The Fateh class, a more advanced Iranian submarine confirmed as active in last week's exercise, adds a capability the Ghadir does not have. It can launch cruise missiles from submerged position. In August 2024, Iranian state media confirmed a successful cruise missile test from a small submarine, demonstrating an evolving offensive capability not previously confirmed publicly. That matters because it extends the threat beyond mine laying into active strike capacity from a platform that is genuinely difficult to locate in acoustically complex shallow waters. Now, add the third layer, the one that gets the most media attention and is actually the most visible and therefore the most manageable for U.S. naval planners. Iran's fast attack craft. The IRGC operates hundreds of high-speed vessels capable of 50 to 70 knots, each equipped with anti-ship missiles, rockets, and mine-laying capacity. Individually, none of them threaten an Aegis-equipped destroyer in a direct engagement. As a coordinated swarm from multiple coastal positions simultaneously, the math changes. The USS Carney's experience during the Houthi campaign in the Red Sea from 2023 through 2025 demonstrated this exchange rate problem in real, documented operational conditions. Each defensive intercept against a drone or subsonic missile costs between $400,000 and $2 million, depending on the interceptor used. An Iranian fast boat costs a fraction of that. You do not win a swarm engagement by shooting down every incoming target. You win by overwhelming the cost ratio until the defender exhausts interceptors or accepts damage. Iran's IRGC Navy doctrine, described by the Alma Research Center as mosaic decentralization, is specifically designed to keep local commands operational under heavy electronic attack. This means that even if U.S. forces destroy central command nodes in the opening hours of a campaign, a standard opening move, the swarm keeps functioning autonomously. Distributed command, dispersed assets, no single point of failure that a first salvo can eliminate. That took decades to build, and it is operational right now in those waters. Now step back and look at all three layers together. Mines creating economic paralysis, submarines creating undersea uncertainty, swarms creating cost attrition at the surface. What you are looking at is not a military designed to defeat the United States Navy. It is a system designed to make the strait ungovernable at a cost Washington cannot easily absorb politically. There is a phrase analysts use for this, sea denial doctrine. The goal is not sea control. The goal is to deny the other side the ability to use the corridor freely and confidently. The Congressional Research Service noted in its 2025 assessment that Iran's naval branches sustained only minor damage during the June 2025 conflict with Israel and the United States. Ballistic missiles, nuclear sites, and air defenses took significant hits during that 12-day conflict. The IRGC Navy, built for shallow water operations, largely survived intact, which means the force Iran demonstrated in the smart control drills last week is not a rebuilt force projecting confidence it does not have. It is a largely intact force in its home geography. In my view, that combination, intact assets, home waters, multilateral partners on station, precise timing, is what the current media coverage is most significantly underweighting. And we have not yet discussed the one piece of this architecture that may matter more strategically than all the hardware we just walked through. In the next section, we go inside what Russia and China each bring to this formation, because both contributions are not what most coverage suggests, and one of them changed the military environment permanently. China sent a spy ship to the strait, and almost no mainstream outlet gave that vessel the attention it actually deserves. The Liaowang 1 is not a destroyer. It carries no vertical launch cells, no anti-ship missiles, no offensive weapons of any kind in the traditional sense. What it carries is something that, in the context of this specific standoff, may be more strategically significant than anything else in the water right now. The Liaowang 1 is a dedicated intelligence collection vessel. Its entire operational purpose is to track and monitor military assets, specifically U.S. carrier strike group movements, in real time. According to Military Watch magazine, the ship integrates a sensor suite designed to provide targeting data that could support Iranian missile, drone, and air defense operations. Think carefully about what that means in practice. China sent a vessel whose job is to watch every move the Abraham Lincoln and the Gerald R. Ford make, and relay that data continuously, not to Beijing alone. The question of who else receives that feed answers itself when you consider what country is hosting the exercise and what country has the missiles to act on the data. This is not speculation. This is the explicit concern that U.S. defense analysts raised in official assessments published in the days after the Liaowang 1's deployment was confirmed. In my view, this single vessel changes the military environment more than any warship in the formation, because information advantage in modern naval warfare is often decisive before a shot is fired. And the ship that provides it came from China, arrived on schedule, and is operating openly in international waters where no one can legally demand it leave. Now, let's talk about the Type 055, the destroyer that accompanied the Liaowang 1, because this platform deserves more than the technical summary it usually gets in Western media. The Type 055 Renhai class displaces over 12,000 tons. It carries 112 vertical launch cells. It integrates a dual-band radar system similar to what the U.S. Navy attempted, but failed to put on the Zumwalt-class destroyer. According to wargame results published in February 2026, a single Type 055 operating with unmanned missile boats was assessed as capable of neutralizing 8 U.S. Arleigh Burke destroyers in a simulated engagement. Those numbers come from wargames, not combat, and should be read with appropriate caution. But they reflect the institutional assessment of the platform by analysts who study it professionally. The Type 055 was accompanied in this formation by a Type 052D destroyer, the Tangshan, which adds layered air defense, anti-submarine warfare, and advanced radar capability to the group. Together, that formation is what the War Zone, one of the most respected U.S. defense publications, said Washington must directly factor into its military strike planning. The publication noted that having Russian or Chinese warships physically present during any U.S. operation against Iran creates military and political complications planners must address. That is a significant statement. It means the planning process for a U.S. strike is no longer a bilateral Iran-U.S. calculation. It requires modeling 3 separate navies simultaneously. Now let's turn to Russia, because Russia's contribution to this formation is the one that most coverage gets most wrong, and getting it wrong leads to completely misreading the situation. Russia's surface fleet in this region is genuinely constrained in 2026. The war in Ukraine extracted a real toll on Russian naval capacity and forward deployment options. This is not disputed. What Russia sent was a Baltic Fleet corvette, the Stoiky, and the Pacific Fleet frigate Marshal Shaposhnikov. These are not the most capable vessels in the Russian Navy by current standards. So when commentators say Russia's contribution is mostly symbolic, they are correct about the hardware. What they are missing is that the hardware is not Russia's primary contribution here. Russia's most significant contribution to this formation has nothing to do with missiles or tonnage. It has to do with what happens the moment a Russian warship is physically present in those waters. When Russia participates in this exercise, this stops being a China-Iran regional drill by any definition that Washington can comfortably use in its public communications or legal framing. It becomes a trilateral deployment of 3 permanent UN Security Council members, 2 of them holding active nuclear arsenals, all 3 holding veto power over any UN resolution authorizing a response. That diplomatic framing raises the political cost of any U.S. action by an order of magnitude that no press conference and no Pentagon briefing can offset or neutralize after the fact. You cannot call this a rogue state provocation when 2 permanent Security Council members are physically present in the water. That label simply doesn't hold in any international forum. Every statement Washington makes publicly, every justification the Pentagon offers, every legal argument for action now has to account for the presence of those 2 permanent members in the same geography. Russia also brings something more specific that received almost no coverage in the Western press: electronic warfare systems refined through 3 full years of active combat in Ukraine. The 2025 iteration of Maritime Security Belt, 1 year before this exercise, explicitly included electronic warfare simulations for the first time, according to the Defense Security Asia Assessment. Electronic warfare in a naval context means radar jamming, GPS spoofing, communications disruption, and interference with the sensor networks that carrier strike groups depend on entirely for situational awareness. Those Russian systems have not been tested in a laboratory under ideal conditions. They have been iterated and updated in real combat against NATO-supplied equipment in an active war zone. When you layer that operational electronic warfare depth over China's surveillance reach and Iran's sea denial assets, what you get starts to function like an integrated operational architecture. Each country contributing the specific capability the others don't have. Iran provides the geography and the asymmetric tools. China provides the surveillance umbrella and long-range strike reach. Russia provides the nuclear credibility, the electronic warfare depth refined in combat, and the diplomatic weight that prevents Washington from framing this as a manageable regional problem. None of these 3 countries holds a formal mutual defense treaty with the others. There is no NATO equivalent here, no Article 5, no binding obligation if one of them is struck. What they have instead is 7 years of deliberate, deepening coordination, shared procedures, communication protocols, and tactical familiarity built through repetition in the same geography. In my view, that practical operational depth may matter more than any formal treaty signed in a conference room. Treaties describe obligations. 7 years of exercises demonstrate actual capability. And here's the connection that almost no mainstream outlet made this week. And it is the one that reframes everything else in this story. This exercise did not begin in the Strait of Hormuz. It began in a completely different ocean 6 weeks earlier on the other side of the planet. In January 2026, Russia, China, Iran, the UAE, and South Africa conducted joint naval exercises in the South Atlantic. The exercise was called Will for Peace 2026. According to TASS, it was explicitly framed as the first BRICS naval exercise in history, a deliberate strategic milestone, not a diplomatic footnote in a regional press release. Patrushev's words in his February 17th interview to Argumenti I Fatti were direct. BRICS needs to be given a full-fledged strategic maritime dimension, and both exercises prove it. Think about what that phrase means when you trace its implications carefully. BRICS started as an economic conversation. Trade routes, development banks, alternatives to dollar-denominated settlement. Now it is running synchronized naval exercises across 2 separate oceans in the same calendar month. South Atlantic in January, Strait of Hormuz in February, same governments, same week the carriers moved. The economic project and the military posture are being stitched together into one unified architecture. In plain sight, with official statements confirming the design explicitly. What this suggests when you pull all 3 sections of this story together, Iran's layered denial architecture, China's surveillance and strike capability, Russia's diplomatic and electronic warfare weight, is that what is assembled in the Strait of Hormuz right now is not primarily a combat formation designed to fight a war. It is a deterrence and escalation management architecture. Each layer raises the cost of American action without requiring anyone to fire a shot. Each layer has been rehearsed and improved over 7 consecutive years in this exact geography, and the architecture is built around a number that ties every thread together more clearly than any weapon system or diplomatic statement could. That number is what J.P. Morgan published as its official estimate for where crude oil prices go if the strait closes. In the next section, we go inside exactly what that number means, and why it may be the most decisive factor in the Situation Room right now. Here is the number that changes everything else in this story. And it comes from the largest bank in the United States. J.P. Morgan published an official scenario analysis placing crude oil at $120 to $130 per barrel in the event of a Strait of Hormuz closure. Not a fringe analyst, not a political commentator. The largest bank on earth, in a formal note to institutional clients, put that number on paper. As of February 25th, Brent crude is trading at approximately $64 per barrel, while WTI is sitting just above $60 on global markets. The gap between where oil is today and where J.P. Morgan says it goes in a closure scenario is not just a financial figure. It is the entire strategic logic of this standoff expressed as a single number. And here is what makes that number so consequential for Washington specifically. Not for Beijing, not for Tehran, but for the administration currently making decisions inside the Situation Room. WTI crude at $60 per barrel is almost exactly the average break-even price for drilling a new well across most of America's shale-producing regions, according to the Dallas Federal Reserve Energy Survey. The Permian Basin, the backbone of U.S. domestic energy production and the foundation of Trump's energy dominance agenda, requires approximately $65 per barrel to profitably drill a new well. Below that level, capital spending contracts. Drilling rigs get pulled, new wells stop being economically viable, U.S. production begins to stagnate on a timeline measured in months, not years. That is the floor the domestic energy industry needs in order to function. At the scale the current administration has promised the American public it will deliver. Now look at both ends of the pressure on that floor simultaneously, because this is where the strategic trap becomes visible. On one side, an administration committed to lowering inflation and reducing energy costs needs prices to stay low. Gasoline below $3 is a political asset. On the other side, the same administration committed to energy dominance and domestic production needs prices high enough that shale drilling remains profitable and the rig count stays up. That is an extraordinarily narrow band to navigate, and 3 navies assembling in the world's most critical oil corridor make it structurally impossible to control that band without resolving the underlying tension. Goldman Sachs published its own scenario note. Its estimate: oil prices could reach $100 per barrel if the strait were blocked, according to analysis cited in February 2026. Multiple industry experts told Reuters that a closure would have a major near-term impact on oil prices, with the duration of disruption determining the severity of the global supply shock. The Dallas Federal Reserve ran a formal disruption scenario in its August 2025 research publication. Their modeling shows a Hormuz closure driving WTI toward $100 per barrel. The same analysis found a cumulative 1.3 percentage point increase in annualized U.S. headline inflation within 6 months of a sustained closure, a figure that fed directly into White House economic modeling, 1.3 percentage points. In an economy where the Federal Reserve spent 3 years trying to claw inflation back toward its 2% target, that number is not an abstraction. It is a political crisis. At $100 oil, the average American household spends roughly an additional $2,000 to $3,000 per year on energy-related costs. Fuel, heating, freight, embedded in the price of every product they buy. That is the domestic economic consequence of the military decision currently being modeled in Washington. Not a line on a geopolitical map, $2,000 out of the pocket of every American family. And here is the piece of the energy architecture that almost no outlet connected this week. The piece that reframes who the situation is actually hardest on. According to EIA data, approximately 84% of all crude oil and LNG moving through the Strait of Hormuz in 2024 went to Asian markets. China, India, Japan, and South Korea absorbed nearly 69% of all Hormuz flows. The United States, by contrast, sources roughly 7% of its crude imports through the strait. American domestic shale production over the past decade has significantly reduced direct U.S. exposure to Hormuz flows, which means the country most economically threatened by a disruption is not the country with the carriers in the water. China imports approximately 25% of its total oil supply through the Strait of Hormuz. A full closure does not just spike prices for Beijing, it creates a direct supply constraint on the Chinese economy. That is why China's Type 055 destroyer was not sent to the strait as a gesture of solidarity. It was sent because China's own economy depends on those 21 miles staying open. Beijing is not defending Iran in this formation. Beijing is defending its own energy supply chain with its own warships in real time in the most consequential choke point on Earth. That reframes the entire confrontation. The country with the most advanced naval assets on the opposing side is also the country with the most direct economic stake in the outcome. Now look at the bypass options, because every briefing in Washington models these, and the numbers are what they are regardless of how the administration frames them publicly. Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline can move approximately 5 million barrels per day. The UAE's Fujairah pipeline adds roughly 1.5 million. Combined bypass capacity around 6.5 million barrels per day. The strait currently moves 20 million. The gap between 6.5 and 20 is not closable on any short timeline. It is a structural reality, not a logistics problem that planning can solve. Emergency strategic petroleum reserves provide a limited buffer. The United States holds approximately 400 million barrels. Europe and major Asian nations collectively hold over 1 billion. At current global consumption rates, that combined reserve buys approximately 2 months of coverage against a full closure. 2 months. That is the entire duration of the world's emergency buffer. After that buffer is exhausted, the global economy is running on supply it cannot replace through any existing alternative route. And the political pressure on Washington to resolve the situation intensifies by the day. In my view, this energy arithmetic is the true foundation of the entire architecture we have walked through in this video. Not the missiles, not the submarines, not the drone swarms. All of those assets matter tactically, but the leverage that makes the whole system function, the reason 7 years of exercises were worth building, is the 20 million barrels with nowhere else to go. The foundation is 20 million barrels per day with no other way out. Everything else, the mines, the Ghadir submarines, the Type 055, the Russian corvette, exists to make that leverage credible. 7 years of exercises were the precise investment required to make that leverage real enough that Washington's planners have to model it seriously before authorizing anything. Now, pull back and look at what is actually on the table as of February 25th, because the negotiation underneath the military posturing has a specific shape. Iran's core demand has not changed in any of the 3 Geneva rounds. It wants sanctions relief, specifically, relief sufficient to restore oil export capacity to pre-2019 levels of roughly 2.5 million barrels per day. Washington's core demand has also not changed. It wants verified limits on enrichment, specifically a halt to 60% enriched uranium, which is one technical step below weapons-grade material. Those two positions are not incompatible on paper. A framework deal is technically possible. Omani mediators have said both sides are closer than they appear in public statements. What makes the gap real is not the technical distance between the positions. It is the domestic political cost each side pays for the optics of what concession looks like from the outside. For Tehran, accepting enrichment limits in the middle of a visible military buildup looks like capitulation under American military pressure. something the supreme leader has publicly defined as unacceptable. For Washington, offering significant sanctions relief while carriers are in position looks like rewarding defiance, something the current administration has staked considerable public credibility on not doing. Both sides are simultaneously at the table and performing for audiences that make the table harder to sit at. That dynamic is not new in diplomacy. What is new is the specific 10-day window Trump publicly defined, and that window is what gives this standoff its specific pressure. Not the carriers alone, and not the drills alone. A publicly stated deadline, visible military capability at sea, and a live diplomatic negotiation all running at once. That is what makes this moment structurally different from every prior Iran standoff. What this suggests when you look at the full picture, the military architecture, the energy economics, the diplomatic shape of the negotiation, is that this confrontation is not primarily about nuclear weapons. It is about who controls the price of entry into the world's most critical energy corridor, and whether that price can still be set unilaterally by Washington, or whether it must now account for 3 governments who have spent 7 consecutive years in this exact geography, making themselves structurally and deliberately impossible to ignore. That question does not get resolved in Geneva this week. It may not get resolved this month. But the answer, whatever form it eventually takes, will determine the shape of global energy security for the decade ahead. The strait is 21 miles wide, the ships are already in it, and the 10-day clock that Trump set in front of the cameras is running. If this changed how you see what is unfolding right now, the military positioning, the energy economics, the diplomatic trap both sides are caught inside, drop a comment below. Do you think Geneva produces a framework this week, or does this standoff continue into March with the strike window fully open? And if you've made it this far, you already know this channel doesn't stop at the headline. Subscribe now, because the next development in this story could come any day.